Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all. Good to see so many of you ventured out on a cold January evening to be here. It's an excellent turnout, I must admit, for our first seminar of 2018. So we welcome you as CIBSE. And I'd just like to say, we have one of our best speakers, I think. I think I'm fair enough to say that. The quality that Dr. Hugh Davis has given us over the years has been excellent from CIBSE HQ. So I would like to welcome you, and Happy New Year to you, sir, 2018. And the subject he's going to share with us today is obviously one that's going to really affect us all over the next few years. So I'm very interested to hear his views on the BREXIT situation and what we're going to look forward to hopefully in the next few years to come. So Hugh, welcome you to the podium, please.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Lionel. Happy New Year to you and to everybody else. And thank you for turning out on a January evening. I can only apologise. Whenever I come here, I seem to have an effect on the traffic. So if you did have a more difficult journey, I do apologise. I have no idea what we can do about it. I think I'm probably going to touch on two things that are going to be important to us over the next year. BREXIT is the main one, but in the process of doing that, I am going to touch on Dame Judith Hackett's independent review of building regs. Some of you may be aware that she published her interim report shortly before Christmas, and there is some fairly significant material in there that we are going to have to engage with one way or another. So I will touch on that as well. I've got a lot to get through, but if at any point I say something and you think, hang on a minute, where's that come from, or why does he think that, please do stick a hand up. I think it's probably better to try and answer it at the time than get to the end and then you try to think, now what was that question I had on? So do please do that. My only limitation is I do want to get back to New Street in time to get a train home tonight. What I'm going to aim to work through this evening is there on the slide. I'm not going to play Let's Read the Slide to you, because you can read the stuff quicker than I can read it out. What I have said to Lionel and the committee, I will provide a PDF version of the slides afterwards. And again, if there's anything that crops up that does need clarifying, I'll try and make sure that it's clear in the slides before I send them through. Because inevitably there's something that isn't quite clear. So that's where we're going to go. I'm going to have a look at the whole issue around energy policy and legislation, because it is complicated. I'm going to have a look at things like the Climate Change Act and carbon budgets and the Clean Growth Strategy, because they give us some ideas of where there are some fixed points. It's easy to think, oh, well, you know, we're leaving the EU, we don't know what that entails. Well, we don't know everything about it. We don't know some fairly significant things about it. But there are some areas that are actually much clearer, perhaps, than people realise. So I want to do a bit of that, and then I want to think about what life after Brexit might look like in a number of areas. I do think, and I hope you won't mind me using this one, with apologies to the younger people who may not remember this chap, who was the US Secretary of State for Defence about 15 years ago, Donald Rumsfeld, and he came out with this little gem, which actually, when you look at it, is quite sensible, whatever people thought of Rumsfeld. There are no knowns. There are things that we know, and there are known unknowns. So, you know, there are things where we can say, well, we don't know what's going to happen about that. And then obviously there are the unknown unknowns, which are the things that we don't know that we don't know. Now, there must be some of them around Brexit, but because they're unknown unknowns, I'm not going to be able to touch on them very effectively tonight. So let's start with some known knowns, and I'm just going to pop this slide up again from time to time, and my first topic is where energy-related policy meets building-related legislation. Oh, why has that slide done that? It's not meant to. I do apologise. I hope it's not going to do it all the time. So, we're committed to leaving the EU. I'm not going to discuss Tony Blair's latest appearance on the Today programme. But at the moment, we're committed to leaving the EU in April of next year. So what are the potential implications? And then, secondly, what are the likely outcomes of the EU withdrawal bill? Now, at this point, clearly there's some speculation. But again, there are things we already know and are worth talking about. And there are some causes of concern. And somebody's already come and asked me if I'm going to deal with some of that in the course of this evening. So we may have a little bit of a discussion there. And then we've got the Climate Change Act. Climate Change Act is a UK piece of legislation, nothing to do with the EU. So what does that bring to the party? And it is worth noting that there are some questions around energy markets. And at this stage, they are questions. What will happen to the EU emissions trading scheme? Will we still be part of it or not? I don't know, nobody knows, it hasn't been agreed. What happens to the European energy market? And how will that evolve as we leave? Again, we don't know, and therefore we don't know what the implications of that are going to be, but it's likely that there might be some changes. What's going to happen to some of the interconnectors? Again, at this stage, we don't know, it's up for negotiation. But you can see there are some things there that might lead to a tighter energy supply in the UK. Worth bearing that one in mind as we work through this a little later. So, some of you may have seen a similar slide to this before. You won't have seen anything quite like this. Because the one bit right up in the top right-hand corner, those of you who are used to dealing with the Department of Communities and Local Government, I'm sorry to say it is no more. It's now the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Malcolm Orme, who's sitting here, can probably remember at least 5 variants of that departmental name over the last 15 years. And this is the latest. I suspect it's just to emphasise that that's where housing is, and possibly to give the impression that the government's paying attention to housing a little more than was obvious before. Apart from that, not huge changes in terms of the topics. Perhaps building regulations is now a slightly bigger issue for obvious reasons. And what this slide does is it shows you that we're dealing with at least 3 different government departments in all of this. And then what this slide does is to show which of these areas have a European implication and which ones are domestic. Now, why does that matter? Well, to put it into a text form that you can analyse perhaps more easily, here are 12 energy and carbon related regulations. I'm not claiming this is exhaustive. It used to have 10 points on it, and 2 of them have been added by people sticking their hand up in a session like this and saying, what about? And there's no reason why something else couldn't get added. And that's the simple version of the list. You can then do a little piece of analysis, which is how much of this is European and how much of this is domestic. So we'll do that. Blue for Europe, red for the UK. And as you see, there's quite a mix. So some of these things are going to be affected by us leaving the EU, and some of them might not be. Then you can do a little bit more analysis, which is to ask, where do we have a mix of EU and UK legislation? Of course, you mix blue and red and you get purple, which is UKIP's colour, so that's quite... We've got to have a bit of fun in this somewhere. And I have got to remember I'm being recorded, so I've got to be careful what I say at certain points. So, energy performance certificates, we've got them because they're in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. but they're implemented through the building regulations, which is a piece of UK legislation. Building regulations, therefore, they've got these bits of European implementation in them. Malcolm's pulling a face, which worries me. If you're not happy, do say, please. Minimum energy efficiency standards then increase the complexity because, and I hope is everybody familiar with minimum energy efficiency standards? I've got a couple of slides on them later because they're coming in on the 1st of April, so now's a good time to be up to speed with them. And it's effectively, if you've got a building that is F or G rated, you won't be able to rent it out. Now, F or G rated, what's that? That's an EPC rating. So we've got minimum energy efficiency standards made under powers from the UK Energy Act from 2011, but using EPCs, which are a piece of European legislation. Can you begin to see what a tangled web we've got? And the idea of, oh, if it's European, we're not going to do it, might be a bit of a challenge. And then finally, I've put this one in, we've now got quite a clear focus on building regulations and Dame Judith's review and one or two other things which I will pick up on later. Now, I hope this next slide is not going to right, so I want to talk a bit about the Climate Change Act and carbon budgets. Why? Climate Change Act is an entirely UK piece of legislation. Passed in 2008 by I think it was introduced under Tony Blair and may well have got through under Gordon Brown, but it's a piece of UK legislation. It commits the UK to significant carbon reductions out to 2050. And I hope you're familiar that this is being done through a series of carbon budgets. It's not directly linked to EU legislation. There is no obvious reason why it should be affected by us leaving the EU. But then it gets a bit more confused, or not confusing, complex, because the government in the clean growth strategy that came out last October makes quite a meal of the various things that we've done to reduce emissions. And that's fair. We have reduced our emissions significantly since 1990. And to be fair, the government acknowledges that that's been a relatively easy path, and it's going to get more difficult. And I think they're absolutely right to acknowledge that. What they're not quite so quick to own up to is that some of those emissions reductions, anything arising from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, anything arising from the Energy Efficiency Directive, anything from the Renewable Energy Directive, they're all EU inspired, feeding through into our UK emissions reduction. What point am I trying to make? We are making progress under the Climate Change Act, but some of that progress is being delivered through measures that have come from Europe. And we've got a way to go to meet the targets under the Climate Change Act going forward. So we have to achieve an 80% reduction by 2050 relative to 1990 levels. That's going to take a little bit of doing. And we need to achieve a 57% reduction by 2030. And we're a little over halfway there. But when you think of the things that we've been able to do to achieve that, phasing out coal, well, we can't go on phasing out coal because it's now going to be phased out properly by 2025. So we're going to need a few more measures. And you begin to think, well, under those circumstances, it would actually, I'd be bold enough to say, even on the audio, it would be insane to go tearing up some of the things that are already in place, even if they have got a blue badge with a ring of yellow stars on it, because if we do tear them up, we're either going to have to replicate them with something that hasn't got a blue badge and yellow stars on it, or we're going to have to come up with some alternative measure to replace the emissions reduction that we're losing by tearing that up. And that's assuming that the government can find both the administrative capacity and the parliamentary capacity to cope with it. Because there's quite a bit of legislation to be got through by March of next year without messing around with this stuff. So, I think there is quite a strong argument that with the Climate Change Act there and some of the measures that are already in place and the targets that we've got to meet, the things that we can already see in place are unlikely to be disappearing anytime soon. So, the good news is that we've achieved a 40% reduction in emissions since 1990. But the Committee for Climate Change, the Committee for Climate Change in their most recent report looking at how we're doing makes it very clear, yes, we're doing okay, but we've really got to work hard to maintain progress. And as I said a few minutes ago, even the government acknowledges that it's going to be tough. So there is a link between Brexit and the Climate Change Act, and that was actually acknowledged in 2016. I nearly said last year. It was acknowledged in 2016, and the quotes are worth having a look at later. I'm not going to dwell on them now. But what they do demonstrate is that there is an understanding at the parliamentary level that this quote, the top quote, talks about the UK intends to ratify the Paris Agreement. We have now. That's committing us to maintaining progress on reducing emissions. So, clean growth strategy. Now this is more recent. It came out in October last year. It's 180 odd pages, but if you go looking on the internet, you will find it. And now this is a direct quote from Greg Clark and his department. In order to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, I will read this one, we will need to drive a significant acceleration in the pace of decarbonisation, and in this strategy we've set out stretching domestic policies that keep us on track to meet our carbon budgets. And that's a fair comment. Perhaps I'd add, they're going to be stretching if they're actually implemented. But I'll come back to that in a second. If they are implemented, then yes, there is every prospect of us continuing to meet the targets. But the reality is that hitting our carbon budgets and expanding the low carbon economy will not be easy. And again, this is quote from the strategy. Yes, we've achieved significant results in the power and waste sectors, but we can't carry on achieving significant reductions from there, and the government acknowledges we've got to roll that out more widely. And transport, business and industry are noted. And then we've got emissions from heating our homes and our businesses, which account for almost a third of UK emissions. So decarbonising heat is going to be a really big issue. Never mind the legislation, never mind Brexit, we're going to have to find ways of keeping ourselves warm without emitting as much carbon. And the government view is that if this is done the right way, it can benefit us all, improve productivity, improve air quality, and create more jobs and more export opportunities. If we can get all of that right, there's no reason why it shouldn't do many of those things. But it's, that's not exactly an easy or quick thing to do. And some of the other policy documents that have come out, that came out alongside the Clean Growth Strategy, do leave you wondering how well we're going to do on some of those fronts. just to give you a feel for it, the clean growth strategy, this is the thing that was delayed by about 15 months. It was originally going to be the emissions reduction plan, and then it was going to be the carbon reduction plan, and then it became the clean growth strategy. This is tied up with the requirements, again, in the Climate Change Act for the government to set out a plan for how it's going to do all of this. And apologies, there's the first thing that needs correcting before I send the slides. That should be there are 102 different policies and measures. Now, the fact that they say policies and measures is quite interesting, because some of them you look at and say, yeah, that's fine, but how on earth are you going to do that? And there's some work to be done to formulate. There's talk about decarbonising heat. Well, yeah, we all understand that, but what's that actually going to mean? Not clear at this point. 51 of them relate to buildings and industry, and I don't think anybody's deliberately been dividing by 2 or 3 here. 17 of them are relevant to industry and commercial buildings, and 17 relate to things that can be done with our homes. And again, there's entirely sensible stuff there, but it's not entirely clear how it's going to be delivered. So significant potential opportunity, but it's got to be followed through. So, between the Climate Change Act and the Clean Growth Strategy, there's quite a lot in place that commits government to carrying on doing a number of things, and a number of those things are based on policies and measures that have come through from Europe over the last 10 or 15 years. Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, Energy Efficiency Directive, the Renewable Energy Directive are 3 examples. And there is a clear commitment to continue the trajectory of cutting emissions under the Climate Change Act, and there's a clear commitment to looking to develop low carbon and clean technology through the Clean Growth Strategy. I think the conclusion from that is that we're not going to see a